I've had many cases over the years, some small, some large, some fixed to the walls, some I've made myself, some I've had pre-made for me. Each of these cases that I've had over the time has just been dictated really by the needs that I had, whether it was playing out live or whether it was the kind of size and shape of my studio that I was currently in. And due to a new studio setup that I've got, it was time to reassess and have a look at a new case for my studio setup. So I'm here to tell you exactly about that. I'm going to tell you how I designed and built my own studio racks, completely bespoke to my needs. Now I know there is a ton of videos already online about building your own case, fine, but I think this is really going to be helpful for those of you who want to build your own pro case for a studio, completely bespoke to your needs, your sizes, your dimensions, your layout, everything. So these are my new cases, all ready to be loaded with modules, which will be in my next video. I'll probably do that as a live stream of me putting the modules in the case. I can tell you about the modules, why I've chosen particular modules, how I use them, and if you join me live, you can ask any questions that you might have as I'm slowly filling it up. So don't forget to hit the subscribe, the like, and the bell button so you can be notified when that one goes live. So let's start at the beginning. The requirements. What did I need? Well, my previous studio setup was comprised of two 13U cases at 126 HP. These were pretty big for me. These are the biggest cases that I've ever had, and I really didn't think that I was going to need any more space. But I think we always say that, don't we, about Eurorack? Yeah, you know what I mean. So these were made for me and were designed to be wall mounted. The idea of wall mounting them though came from a picture of fellow electronic music producer Tom Hall, who makes amazing music and is completely into his Max MSP and Nord and modular and that kind of stuff. I'll put a link to his Instagram and go check him out. It's really cool. I saw this picture on his Instagram and I just thought, that's perfect. That's going to fit in the studio that I had at the time, which actually was a pretty small space. So that was one of the reasons why I was going to put this case on the wall. Now, the pros of having this on the wall gave me a lot of desk space. It also gave me the option to kind of sit or stand depending on what I wanted to do at the time. I also think they just looked really cool as well. You know, I could have that fancy lighting. They're mounted off the wall a little bit, looked really great on camera. Now the cons of this, unfortunately, was that my speakers were very wide apart. You know, I'd be there patching away, my speakers would be to my very far left and right, and it really messed up with the stereo imaging. But I did become accustomed to it over time. Not only that, my computer had to sit to one side, so I was kind of always looking over to one side all the time when I was doing some editing. And again, my speakers were then in the wrong position. So yeah, it worked, it looked cool, it functioned like I needed it to, but it was mainly the speakers and the computer screen that was the issue. So I really had to think about that this time around in my new studio space. If you're interested to know, these actual racks were built by someone on Etsy. If you go on Etsy, actually, of all the places, there's some really great cabinet makers out there and people who do Eurorack cases to your specifications. So do go check that out if you're interested in maybe going down that route of having your own case made. These turned up with the bus boards in, the power in, it was all ready to go. All I had to do was put them on the wall, fill it up with modules and turn them on. So yeah, in my new studio here, I just wanted to make sure that I was going to have the speakers always in a good place. So I've got my stereo imaging going on, that there was a place for my computer screen in front of me at all times as well. So when I am doing any editing or anything like that, because I do tend to use the computer in conjunction with Eurorack quite a lot of the time, I like that hybrid setup. So it always had to be ready to go in this new studio space. So I sat there thinking about the height and the depth and where my screen was going to go and how wide the desk was that I had to work with and how many modules I've accumulated over time. And I knew that there wouldn't be anything off the shelf out there that I could get. So I really did want to make this to my own specifications and make sure that this was going to work exactly how I wanted it to. You know, when I'm thinking about how far I want to reach, how many modules I've got right in front of me on a lower, and which ones are going to be further away to get, and what's the depth of that, and you know, where's the bus boards going to go? How am I going to mount the power supplies inside of there? Where am I going to put the off and on switches? All that kind of thing. I also wanted to make sure that I had a bit of space on the desk that these cases are going to sit on, so I could have my MIDI controllers and the volume controller and things like that I just needed to have straight in front of me at all times. The other thing that I thought about putting into the design was to have the ability to actually have the case on its back or on its front, and each one of those dimensions was going to be slightly different. So that way I could have the case where it's actually quite shallow on the desk but very tall, or I flip it round and it would be not as tall and actually come out a lot further. So depending on what setup I wanted, I'd be able to just literally flip the case around, move the power switches, and I'm good to go. So I knew that the desk that I was going to put these cases on was about 2 meters wide. So that meant that I could have a total of about 336 HP overall. That made each case 168 HP. So I started sketching some designs and scouring the internet, looking at different designs, different woods being used. You know, I went down the rabbit hole of looking at forums and discussions about do's and don'ts. And I guess one of the first things I stumbled across, which was really interesting, was somebody had actually made a Eurorack case using aluminium. Now, these aluminium rails meant that essentially you could build your own modular case, in that you could change the shape of it. You literally unscrew the rails, you can move them around, you can have them at different heights and dimension. So as you know, as your Eurorack collection grows or shrinks, you can change that around. Maybe you want to have more higher or more lower in front of you. You can change the dimensions of this case using these aluminium rails. So this design I came across was on a Reddit forum and uses this exact setup of using aluminium rails. And you can see that with some careful consideration, you could put something together that is very lightweight, had a lot of airflow, and could be rearranged in future. Brilliant, I thought, until I got a little deeper into this whole aluminium rail design concept, and I realized that this was going to take a lot of time and head scratching to put something like this together. So with that in mind, I decided to go back and just use wood for the cases. Just keep it simple, Matt. So when I got an idea for the height and the depth and that kind of thing, I actually made a cardboard cutout. It looks something like this. It's actually broken now. But with this cardboard cutout, it allowed me to actually visualize and see how big it was going to be and how it was going to function. So I could figure out where I wanted my 3Us, my 1Us, where the power supplies were going to be, where the bus boards were going to be mounted, all that kind of thing. This was really useful to do, actually. And yeah, I actually learned a lot by doing this, because I could see immediately some things were not going to work. For example, I was making it too shallow in one particular area, and there just wasn't going to be enough room behind the modules and the bus to have the bus boards for them to connect to. It was just going to be way too close. So do bear that in mind when you're designing your case. You know, you're going to have some modules like this where it's quite thin in some areas, and then you have a sticky out bit, you know, so whereas other ones might be more uniformed like this and maybe not as deep. I think this is one of the most shallowest modules that I have, which is Pam's new workout. And I mean, that's just super duper thin. And obviously an easy way to figure this out, which modules are going to be maybe a problem, which ones are going to be deeper, which ones are going to be shallower, is just to head over to Modular Grid and build your case on there, have a look at the specifications, look at what your deepest module is that you've got, and kind of work from that. So next up was power. I was going to need a lot of power. I knew that I was going to have to essentially double the power that I had in my previous case. So looking around the internet, I found a really good website called Modular Synth Lab. Now on this website there's a whole section dedicated to actually building your own modular case. It's got everything in there, from your rails, your screws, your power supplies, your bus boards, basically everything that you need in order to build your own Eurorack case, except for the case and the wood itself. So I decided to settle on the power supplies that I was using in my previous case, which are these. These are the Meanwell RT65B power supplies. These are basically quite a famous budget Eurorack power supply, as they call them. And I was already using these, so I thought it best to go for these, because I didn't have any issues with these in the past. However, this is where I made my first mistake. In fact, it was my friend Dan at DPW, who makes some excellent Eurorack modules. He actually noted that I needed to get some different power supplies and that these ones that I'd purchased just weren't going to work. So Dan suggested I went for these, which again are made by Meanwell. Look pretty much exactly the same, but they offer all the power that I need to run all of those modules. And remember, I'm looking at about 160 modules per case. So I actually need about 2 of these in order to power all 8 bus boards sufficiently to make sure that I've got all the power that I need for all of the modules. So thanks for this, Dan, and your help. That's been really cool. These are the LRS 112 by Meanwell. I'll put a link down in the description if anyone wants to check these out. And by the way, so Dan at DWP, he makes some awesome modules. I've got both the triple limiter and the spectral enhancer, which I use a lot for shaping both percussion and synth bass lines. More recently, I acquired the MOG module, which is a 4-band distortion. It's got a 1/4-inch jack input on it, as well as a mini jack input, and it just sounds absolutely awesome. He showed me this in Superbooth a couple of years ago, and I just fell in love with it. You can just sculpt so much using the mid-range on it, which is really important when using distortion, and also the amount of low end that you can get out of this. I find with some distortion modules you lose a lot of low end. You can really cane it on this thing. Now Dan's a lovely guy, very intelligent, very funny, and actually he's done his own video on building his own custom small portable Eurorack case, and I'll put a link to that down in the description in case you want to check that out. It's really helpful, and actually really helped me when I was thinking about particular things in putting these cases together that I hadn't really considered before. And in fact, something super important that I realized in his video was that he had built his own DC filtering component, which would sit between the power supply and the bus boards. And what that would do is remove any potential switching noises at about 100 kilohertz. These are passive, so I decided to get a few of these built for me just so I could be sure that I was reducing any potential noise coming from the power supply with the way it switches and that kind of things. These are areas actually I don't quite understand. You know, I'm pretty geeky and I like to geek out, but when it comes to things like power consumption, things like that, it goes a little bit over my head. So I can't thank Dan enough for guiding me on this. He really did help me in terms of choosing the right power supplies and putting this DC filtering, and also just making sure that when I'm wiring everything together, it was done in the most efficient way as well. The last thing you want to do is build these ginormous cases like I'm doing, fill it with all your Eurorack modules, and then realize there's a problem with the power and have to keep taking things out, or the power is just, you know, fluctuating, or it's noisy or something like that. So thank you so much, Dan. So there's a lot of bus boards out there on the market, all made by different brands. And in fact, the ones that I use in my live case are made by Tip Top. I think I've got 3 or 4 bus boards in there. They work absolutely flawlessly. Never had any issues with them. The thing about those Tip Top ones, they're a little bit more expensive than most on the market, and I knew I was going to need a lot of bus boards for my studio cases. So I started scouring the internet and looking for the kind of most cheapest option out there that offered the most amount of connections per board. And after much hunting and consideration, I decided to opt for the bus boards that I'd been using in my previous cases that were wall mounted. These are actually made by Modular Synth Lab themselves, and they can power up to 20 modules per rail. Based on the number of modules I had and leaving room for expansion, I settled on 8 bus boards per case. This gave me the ability to put about 160 modules in each case. The other thing I like about these bus boards is that you can't accidentally insert a module in the wrong way. That's because they have these safety headers, meaning that stupid people like me, who have been known to blow a module or 2, can't do it with these bus boards. So while I was at Modular Synth Lab, I also purchased the rails and any wiring that I needed, also the power inlets, all the screws, the little spacers for mounting the bus boards, and I was set to go basically. Now the bus boards and the rails were basically the most expensive bit of all of this. The wood and the time that I put into this is relatively cheap compared to the rails and the bus boards. And anyone who's doing this with such big cases, you'll find out that, you know, obviously the more that you buy, the more the price just suddenly stacks up, and particularly buying things outside of the United Kingdom, that import duty you pay and the VAT and all that kind of thing, it really adds up. I mean, the 16 bus boards were well over £200. And the rails with the threaded inserts, which I needed a lot of, were around £50 each set in total. And I don't even want to look and remind myself how much I paid for all of the rails in total, because it'll just make me want to cry. But rails are essential, and without them, your modules are just, well, they're just going to lie on the power supply and it'll all blow up. So you need rails. In fact, I did look at cheap alternative for rails. Some people out there have used wood and cardboard and things like this in the past. But no, I needed these things to be solid. So, you know, it's where you spend the money and it's worth it. And the same goes for the bus boards and the power supplies. You know, I've gone for pretty mid-range stuff here, and I've used them before, and I'm pretty sure they're not going to let me down. Okay, so after double and triple checking my design, I finally settled on the dimensions that I was going for, the heights, the width, the depth, where the power supplies were going to go, where the bus boards were going to go. I ordered everything that I needed from Modular Synth Lab. What I needed to do now was essentially find a place where I could send my design off to and get it cut out of wood. Now, my first idea was just to do this myself, go buy some sheets of MDF, put my stencil on there, draw around it, cut it out, glue it all together, job done. And then I got thinking more about things like air vents and where the power sockets were going to go, and just things like this, which made me think, actually, I need to think about this a little bit more before I really settle on this design. And, you know, did I have the right tools to start cutting out air vents and little holes for sockets and that kind of thing? I also needed to make sure that I was making this thing super strong as well. The last thing I wanted was some kind of loose, wobbly case that would move around every time I was putting patch cables in and out. It needed to be absolutely rock solid. So one of the things that I decided to do was actually draw in some tongue and groove elements into the design, and this way that they would lock in to each other when I was building the case, just to get that super strength. Having said this, the rails themselves, once they are in the case, they really do strengthen the case out and do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. But I just wanted to go a bit over the top, get that tongue and groove in there, just to make sure everything was really locked solid. So I needed to really up my game. I knew that just having something like this wasn't going to work. So I started looking into the program that a lot of architects use, which is called AutoCAD, or there's a free version called SketchUp, which I believe is by Google. And these are just typically used by architects and designers. But having started to try and use these programs myself, it soon became clear that these programs were designed for people much more cleverer than me. In fact, I couldn't even draw a square inside of these programs. And, you know, I think that I'm geeky enough to use most programs out there. You know, I build plugins using Max MSP. Could I use AutoCAD? Could I use SketchUp? No. So this is where I brought in a professional architect to help me with AutoCAD. This is David Dowsett. He's a local architect. He's also an electronic music producer as well. And he was able to take my sketches and designs, put them into AutoCAD, and actually make them into very accurate drawings, which I could then send off to have them laser cut by a professional company. David makes awesome music, by the way. Do check out his stuff below. Working with David was easy. Not only did he get what I was after, you know, he's a music producer himself, but he'd never actually really ventured into the world of Eurorack. So he was kind of intrigued about, you know, how these cases are built and designed and set up. And just with a little bit of backwards and forward and a bit of configuring, we nailed it. We got the design right. And then the master files were all ready to be set off to be laser cut. Now, the wood that I went for is essentially just MDF. You know, I wasn't after some really amazing oak finish on all of this. I knew I was going to paint them black anyway. And I understand that there are some really brilliant case makers out there who pride themselves on the finish of the cases and the beauty of the wood that they use and the oils, how they finish it off. Absolutely brilliant, but completely wasted on me and from what I want. I just want something that I can get, I can paint it black, I can put my modules in, and I'm good to go. I also knew that this would also affect my budget if I was to go with some kind of solid oak or something like that over MDF, which was a lot cheaper to work with. So I settled on 12mm MDF. I was going to go for 9mm, but I just thought that that might have been just a little bit too thin. I did really want to go for ply. I do like plywood, but that was a bit more expensive to buy that over the MDF as well. So after a lot of Googling, I basically Googled wood laser cutting companies in the UK. I sent my files off to them and got about 10 different quotes from 10 different companies, and essentially went with the one that I found quickest and most easiest to work with. The files were just simply sent over the internet to them with some extra details on the requirements that I was after. And then a week later, a package arrived, which essentially had my 2 cases in it, like a big jigsaw puzzle where it was all ready to be put together. This was very exciting to see. You know, having worked on the design with David for so long, it was great to just suddenly open up that package and hold up this thing that had just been on the screen for a couple of weeks that you've been kind of working with. I have to say, when I opened it up, I was absolutely delighted with the finish. The wood cut was very, very accurate, very sharp, straight lines. It was exactly how I hoped it was going to be. The black edges you can see here, this is literally carbon from the lasing cutting through the wood. You know, you can actually smell it, and I kind of weirdly liked it in a way. So with the case here, all the equipment has arrived, my power's arrived, my rails arrived, the wood, everything, the wood glue, nails, all good to go. So now it was build time. And building it myself, I knew was going to save me a lot of money, although I knew it was going to be very timely. And in fact, yeah, it took a long time to build these. So let's get into that, and I'll take you through the process of building them. So the first things first, I needed to check that the cases actually all fit together. So I was actually able to connect the cases without any glue or anything like that, using the tongue and groove that we'd designed into it, and it fit. It was perfect. It was rock solid. The rails fit, the modules, the depth that I had and the height, everything was just absolutely bang on, brilliant. So then I took them apart again and reassembled them, this time using some wood glue and just hammering in a few small nails into the tongue and groove areas just to really strengthen it. So the next step was then filling. I just had to fill the holes basically where I'd hammered the screws in just to get a nice smooth finish. And this is also where I discovered my second mistake. So the laser cutter itself, it's got this small tolerance. When the laser actually cuts the wood, it actually removes like 1 millimeter of the wood. So that meant all of the tongue and groove didn't quite match up perfectly when they were put together. So this took, you know, a lot of time to do the filling, the sanding, and then I'd fill a little bit more, and then I'd sand a bit more, and then I'd accidentally damaged what I'd done and I had to put some more on. So this was the bit of the process I didn't really like. However, once happy, it was all ready to be painted. Now the MDF needs to be primed before you do paint it. So I just mixed together some PVA glue and some water and just covered the whole of the units. And what this does, it kind of absorbs into the MDF, creates this kind of skin, so it's all ready for you to paint, and it'll look a lot nicer when it's painted. So these were starting to look a bit of a mess now, I must admit at this point. They weren't looking as smooth and as great as when they first arrived, that's for sure. You know, my poor attempt at sanding and filling and painting them so far with the PVA glue, they just started looking very ugly, and I just couldn't wait to paint them black. Now I was just initially going to spray these. I started on the insides, and what I realized, I wasn't getting a very even finish. Again, spraying's another, you know, it's another technique you've got to get really good at. So I just decided to do the insides and the backs, you know, the bits that you don't really see. And I didn't need to spend a long time painting them, just spray it over, and it was good enough for me. You know, you don't really see those parts. And then for the outside, I knew I wasn't going to get this super even finish. So I actually opted for this paint that you might use sometimes on guitar amplifiers. And it's very thick, kind of greasy looking paint, and if you use a paint roller with it, you get this kind of very even stippled effect across your finish. You can see here that I put some masking tape around the edges to keep the spray painted area clear of this paint that I was putting on. So once I'd done a coat, I'd let that dry, and then I would do some more paint if needed, and I just kept going until I felt that they were kind of evenly covered and it looked good enough for me. So the next thing was power, and that was really, again, another lengthy process. You've got to get this right for health and safety reasons, obviously, and for me, reasons that I mentioned before about just nailing your power when you get it in. Just make sure that your wiring, your cabling, all that is just nice and neat. Do short electric cable runs as much as possible, and just checking everything as you're going along twice just to make sure that everything is correct. Once done, the rails were fitted. That went in nice and quickly. I even bought some little rubber feet, which I screwed to the bottom of the units, which raises them up about 5 to 10 millimeters. And what that allows me to do is actually run cables underneath the cases. So for example, if I've got my BeatStep Pro in front of the case, I can have the cables going out underneath that without them going off to the side. Or if I've got my volume control for my speakers here, I can run the cables underneath the case rather than off the side of the desk and on the floor and that kind of thing. And there we go, done. Everything in. Now time to put the modules in. And like I say, I'm not going to do that in this video, but do hit the subscribe and the bell and the like if you want to join me when I do put them in. I'll do it as a live stream. I can talk about the modules, how I'm using them. You can ask questions about it. It's all very interactive. It'll probably take me ages, so make sure you bring along a cup of tea and some sandwiches. So all in all, was this successful for me? Well, yes, I've ended up with the cases that I wanted. They're the right dimensions. They hold enough modules. They have the right power that I need. So yeah, this has been a success. The only mistakes that I made really was one, getting the wrong power supplies to begin with. Number two was not adding that tolerance on of about 1 millimeter for the cutting of the laser, but there we go. For each case overall, it costs about £500 per case to build. That includes everything, and I think that's pretty good. You know, I've saved quite a lot of money there by going for cheap wood, by going and building it all myself, you know, painting it all myself, spraying it, installing all of the electrics myself. I've saved a lot of money that way. So £500 for each case for everything in is pretty good. I mean, these are pretty big beasts. These are pretty hefty cases. But if you have any other further questions you have about this, do drop it in the comments below. I'd like to say thank you to Dan again, and to David and Module Synth Lab as well. All of you have been absolutely brilliant in helping me get these across the line. These are, you know, they're a big part of what I do. So it's been very important for me to get these right, and you guys have been absolutely brilliant. So thank you so much for all of your help and guidance. So for now, I'll say goodbye. The conversation doesn't end here though. If you've got any comments, any questions, anything that I haven't covered, just put it in the comments below. I'll try and get back to you all. Perhaps you've got an idea about what you would do differently, or maybe I haven't thought about something, or I've approached something in a particular way. Let's share this knowledge. If anyone's got any better ideas about what I've done here or ways to improve it, then please also put that down in the comments below. So yeah, I think that's it.